let me move on to the theme of my talk, which is entrepreneurship made easy. What I'm going to cover are idea generation, strategy, organization building, things which a few tips on things to avoid, and handling adversity and building for the future. So just a very broad set on these areas. I'm hoping that when I finish with this, that we'll have a lively Q&A session, because I really believe the real value in almost all these things comes through the questions which may be at the back of. So how do you get your ideas? And Eisenberg himself then says in the book that actually these ideas can come through what he calls as mini innovation. And that is what is needed. You take existing ideas, existing products, existing services, existing business models, look at them and say, how can they be done differently? And that's what I'm calling as your kaleidoscope shifts. You may need more than one, and you may need to a theory to more than one. But it's amazing that you can then begin to see a situation from a completely different way. The third way, I would say now, of looking at ideas and for is the change, and say the change represents the opportunity. And the good thing is the change is about us all the time, and therefore, and I notice your Professor Agarwal, you also teach management of change. Is that right? One of my own favorite subjects. But change represents opportunity. And of course, you've got issues of how you cope with change. Here you look at this change and look at this thing. So for example, if you look at MindTree, the change was that internet technologies were just coming into the market. So you said, we're not at a disadvantage with respect to people who've been in the industry for 15, 20 years, because they're also getting into that space. And therefore, look at change in that sense. Change can also allow new things to happen, and that's particularly technology changes which were just not feasible earlier. And obviously, that a lot of that is related to Web 2.0, and I'll come to that specifically. I must also add that Happiest Minds also has the same theory behind it. You know, if you look at it in India, we've got at least 150 plus IT companies. The last, what I'd say is even decent sized large company aspiring to become a large player, heading at some point of time to $1 billion, and at least at this point of time about halfway there, is MindTree. In the next 11 years, there's been no other company aspiring to do that, which is surprising in an industry which is otherwise flourishing. And if you look at the change is enormous. It's even more than it was in the internet days, because in that time you had one single thing like this driving change. Now you have cloud, you have mobility, you have social media, you have big data, you've got analytics with that, you have unified communications, you've now got the Internet of Things which are coming up. What has happened in this period of time is that you've got companies which came in and said that we're a mobility company or we're an analytics company. So focused on those as niche entities, people who probably were techies with that sort of experience and said, okay, I know that we can do things differently. But there's no one who came up and said, my role is to say, I'm not going to take any of the legacy to the larger player, to the industry, to my consumers. I'm going to give them the latest technologies, but my ability is to be able to integrate those together into what we call as a smooth, secure, connected experience. Now, as a positioning, you have an opportunity created whereby you are not at any time and using disruptive technologies. So we won't do the legacy, and the larger guys would say we do everything anyway. But it's not that they have any more experience or much more experience in any of this that we have. Certainly not in the way of, on a planned basis, integrating areas of change. So the thesis here is that change itself is the opportunity, and look for the change all around you. There's now coming down to other ways of scoring for ideas. One thing great about the world, and you see this in the way the Snap deals and so on and the others are occurring, or even a Make My Trip a while ago, is that Web 2.0 ventures are by nature, if you ask me, globally applicable opportunities. So if you see, and invariably everything begins in the US, so it could begin somewhere else also, but there are hundreds of those taking off. Silicon Valley is funding, for example, maybe hundreds of ventures every year. Almost all are either Web 2.0, a little variation, and that goes back to my theory of how change and technology makes change possible. And in the old days, where you funded a services company or a product company, the single largest thing they're now funding is software as a service. And that's also So the next part of my point is that what happens in the US now, in the old days it may have taken us 10 years to move into similar opportunities or similar areas or similar ways of doing things. Today, that happens within a year or two. So look at the successful new Web 2.0 entities which are taken off out there, and then see what you could do in terms of adapting that idea if required, and maybe the same idea can be applied. And it's great. Suddenly you've got half a dozen Indian companies which have gone out and are now valued at close to $1 billion. In America, of course, what happens is these very small things at a very early stage of their lives will get valued at these very high prices. And that is the only advantage of perhaps starting sometimes even small without much cash. But the disadvantage of that is that even when that happens, and I think that's the difference between, let us say, a Google and Microsoft, the owners are left with a much smaller percentage of the original equity. So when you look at wealth generation, why is Bill Gates the wealthiest man for multiple years? Now all of these entities are catching up with him in terms of market capitalization, or have even crossed. I mean, Apple obviously is a great example of how it crossed well above that. And yet Steve Jobs' wealth would not even have been a fraction of Bill Gates, simply because Bill Gates was able to retain a larger share of ownership of the company. And that is the biggest disadvantage of the bootstrapping type of approach, where you are able to get only very little money from outside. The company at that stage is not valued very highly, and therefore you end up giving away a very large part of the equity to the investors, who are the ones who then finally make the big money. And if one of the things is its source of wealth generation, you go to examine and say, hey, what is it should be my own goal at the end of the period when I've been able to take the company public in terms of percentage ownership. The third thing is that, which I'd give you is 2 areas of looking at sources for opportunity. One is that any business which can be disintermediated, and there are so many of them. You see this in the way the old financial world has worked very largely. You're seeing it happening in retail. So anywhere where you can cut out intermediate channels, and invariably it's going to involve technology. So when I asked you, how many of you think that you may have an IT-driven project for those of you who want to become entrepreneurs? I'm not encouraging everybody to move into IT, which is what a lot of Web 2.0 or where the business is the platform type of companies would be. But on the other hand, almost every other industry today is becoming IT-driven, IT-led. You may have a pharma, you may have a healthcare offering, for example. Increasingly, the opportunities are on remote diagnostics, healthcare as a service, and so on and so forth. So many things that are almost all IT-led. So do keep that in mind. That those of you who said we're looking at entrepreneurship, don't necessarily look at IT. That's no longer necessarily the item which VCs are funding to the highest extent. They're looking at lots of new industries, but a very high proportion of even the new investments in multiple areas are being IT-driven and IT-led. The third thing which I've been dialoguing with a young person in this thing in the US. She happens to be a classmate, or the daughter of my classmate in Manila. So she's been reaching out in terms of getting mentoring advice, and we've been dialoguing on how she get her right ideas. And actually we came across an interesting thought. All these failed dot-coms of the late early 2000s, let's say, it was 1998, 99 was the dot-com boom. By 2003, bulk of them had gone bust, including the services companies and system integrators who entered the market at that time to service their needs. I'd say MindTree being one of the rare exceptions, and that was also possible because we had to change our strategy. That market disappeared. But if you look at the seeds of those ideas, actually it's not that they were stupid, no, some of them were. I must say some of them were incredibly stupid, and you wonder how VCs actually put money into them. And they put billions and billions of dollars into them. But many of them were ideas which actually were not designed to succeed in what I'll call as a desktop-centric world, but today lend themselves to being very successful in a mobile-centric world. And we're seeing actually the beginning of many of those things. So some of the companies which you're seeing coming up were actually failed experiments of those days. And you could examine some of those thoughts and ideas, and there is so much literature available, and see is there something there which didn't work then, but which could work now. So these are just some indicative ideas on how you could get your own ideas. But whatever it is, in the end, when you do get an idea, when you adopt and to create your business, it has to be something which excites you, excites the team, because you've got to enjoy what you're doing. You're not just saying, I'm doing this because this looks like the best place for me to go to make money. It is something with which you should be able to resonate with in your life. Now, let me come to strategy, and I'll just give you 3 or 4 points which I think I can leave behind for you to think of in terms of strategy. Okay, go ahead.
At the time when you
tell me your names when you all ask a question.
My name is Ruchi.
Okay.
Yeah, so when you are generating ideas, and at that moment you have say 4 or 5 ideas in your mind, how do you go about eliminating the ideas?
Okay. Very valid question, very good question. I think it's not a bad idea to raise the questions actually as we come out of a topic, because then people will relate to it better. I'm open to that as we go ahead. And, you know, see, firstly, there are 3 or 4 things in it. One, obviously, you're going to convert an idea and test that idea out into a business plan. Secondly, I think you're also going to be clear on the size and scale of your ambitions, and you'll find different ideas will have different degrees of scalability as you go through. Third is you've got to be able to see that how much cash you're going to be able to generate for those. So these are basic business fundamental issues which I actually talk of in much greater depth later on. What is it that you and the team bring in terms of making that given idea a success? I think that's also very important as you're able to get the people to say, okay, you need $1 million to start with, and you took $500,000, you straight away given 50% of the company to them. And but the plus about going to the VCs is, frankly, they're a wonderful source for validating ideas. They do add value. I would certainly say this with the 4 VCs. Actually, I had a total of 5, but one which came in the second round didn't contribute to that sort of stage in the entry days. And actually turned out to be the only bad choice out of the 5. So we would have thought we'd do better on the second attempt, but we really got a lousy partner on that occasion, but wonderful for others. The amount of value addition that they do. So I'm saying you need to look at those ideas from multiple angles. You bring a brainstorm, you think about those, the team, whatever that they're getting excited, you bounce those off the VCs. You know, VCs very often, people think that they only fund the idea. What they really fund is the team. And when you bring the team on board, they're willing to sit with you and engage and say, is this going to work or is it not going to work? So if you have more than one, I would say you could even present both of them to the VC. The third thing is when you come to your decision making, I have an approach that I take for myself in terms of any large decision I've ever had to take in my life. And this applies not just to how do you generate and look at an idea, but your bigger decisions, some of you as you move into an entrepreneurial world. Then you do it with your head, your heart and your gut. So the head is that you list out all the pros and cons. And more often than not, when you got a decision, sometimes it's a very big technology decision in a company. These will jump out at you, the decision, and say, this is right. Your heart is saying, what is going to bring fun and excitement and enjoyment to the team? Your gut is your instinct. When you look and say, if I look back on this decision 5 years from now, what do you think is likely to be the best? So you've extended your time horizons to apply your instinct towards the decision. If they all pull you in the same direction, it's great. Because then, and it doesn't even then guarantee that you'll be successful. But it certainly reduces the probability of failure, increases the probability of success. So I think there's a certain amount of thinking. I also believe in another thing in this, is that you need to live with the idea for a while. You need to live, breathe, dream, sleep that idea and say it's not something that just came flash in the pan and I'll move tomorrow. Just think that one through. I mean, I must have thought through entrepreneurship for quite a while before I decided to take the plunge. But that's because I was churning it around in my head all the time and seeing, is this the right thing to do? Okay? So I was saying the next one is strategy. The first thing about, I'd say, with strategy is that you've got to look at this and ask yourself what is the basic soundness of it. Can you enter into a market without, say, a head-on clash with the incumbents or the larger players, for example? Or even if you were going to meet them, are there situations within that where you can exploit the weaknesses of the larger players? Now you might say that's a very tough thing. How does particularly take our business. Both occasions I've entered into a business where there have been multi-billion-dollar companies already there in the market, and even though we may have said, hey, we do things differently, or we do things which are, the other guys don't focus on, The fact of the matter is that they were in the same market. We went to a customer, but more often than not, one of them were larger players. So every one of them does have a weakness. You've got to be able to, there's a very good book on, by David Yoffie, which is called the, I forget, the Jiu-Jitsu model or something like that. You get the name when you get into it. I've given it to quite a few people. The gentleman is a Harvard professor on the Intel board for many years, and he was board at MindTree. It certainly gives you some thoughts of ideas of seeking and looking out for strategies as the larger incumbents in the business. There's another thing I've seen from customers is that, you know, when you deal with them, they will so often tell you that the larger guy will not change what needs to be changed. And that is what really concerns them. You could go on and say that, look, these guys are looking for the larger projects all the time because they need to generate hundreds of $1 millions of new revenue every year. But is your most difficult new innovative project something which is going to get that done? And it's worked for us 100 times over. You know, I was showing you, last year we entered into Sears when we were just a few months old as a company. And they were getting ready with a solution that they wanted to demonstrate at an Apple show in 3 months' time. It had to be mobile. And it was linked to the store's experience. And they had all the big players as their incumbents, who they could have gone to. And we went in and we met them. We said, look here, we're going to be able to give you an A-class team. It's the experience that counts. It doesn't matter that we don't have all of this, and we don't, those guys knew a lot about their business, which we obviously didn't know, but we said we were able to do it. This innovation, we believe that we'd focus on in a way that you'd be able to deliver in 3 months. So sometimes you go to in a new place. In fact, invariably, when we go to a customer, we ask them, do you have an innovation cell? Not just go to the CIO, but innovation cell, what are the new things you're wanting to work on? Maybe they're the ones best adapted to work with you. So you've got to work out the basic strongness of the strategy there. Then can your strategy disrupt existing business? You can. If you've got that sort of an idea, that's wonderful, because there's nothing like a disruptive strategy. It's the larger players, the incumbents, never see it happening. And there's another very good book by Clayton Christensen, who you may have read about, again a Harvard professor. Strangely enough, when I talk about happiness, I quite often also talk about another aspect of what Christensen has written, because there is a strong spiritual side to his nature and has focused on that. But so he's got 2 books, The Innovator's Dilemma and The Innovator's Solution. The first one is much better. It's actually contains, like most sequels, the first one really gives you many of the solutions also. So the point is that existing players never see the disruption happening, or if they don't, they want to ignore it, because it's going to disrupt their own business. Somebody is going to come and cannibalize either their product or their service. They don't want to know about it. Many of the disruptions also begin very small, and when they begin small, it's too much of an effort for them to do it, because that is the time when the projects are small or the service is small. It hasn't acquired a market size. But once it does achieve a certain takeoff path, it's almost too late for those people to re-enter. Which is why, if you really look at it, the leading company in the mainframe era never became the leading mini-computer company. So IBM led to Dell. The leading mini-computer company never became the leading PC company, and so on and so forth. And that's because somebody didn't see the shift towards a different type of thing. And the company which owned all the operating systems in the world, in terms of 95% market share, didn't see the shift towards mobility in the way Microsoft missed that. So incumbents tend to miss or don't get the next wave of that. And therefore you've got to ask yourself, where is that next wave? Where is the world moving towards? And you know, it's not enough even today to say, hey, we've moved into a mobile-centric world. You've moved into much more than that. You've moved into a cloud-centric world. Look at the changes in regulations which in that context are impacting an area like security, because an organization only needed to look at its own boundaries in the old days. Now you've suddenly got resources in the cloud, mobile-centric enterprise applications with different devices on them, organization exposing itself to social media to build a social brand. So the change, and those sort of changes are all disruptive. And people are very hesitant to embrace those sort of changes in terms of ways that they are working. Then there's an issue of no strategy is going to be good around long enough. So you've got to continuously evaluate that strategy. When do you need to make a change? What are the drivers? You need to look for the environmental changes. The same thoughts which led to your original idea, but they may be making your new idea unviable for whatever reason. There are environmental changes, there are competitive changes, there are landscape changes, and therefore you need to keep asking yourself, what is it you need to do to change your strategy in order to be able to adapt? Now, and I think the best example is the dot-com boom to bust. After all, even if it was a great entry strategy, those companies did not start their businesses with a view to saying we'll take a 1 or 2 year benefit. So the Science and Viance and all those system integrators in the US, and I can name 20 of them in India, why is it that they all collapsed? Didn't they see, or maybe nobody saw the change came in because it was so dramatic. I mean, 1 year there was business and a few months later it had all dried up. And in the beginning when there was business, nobody asked you what price. They were willing to pay the moon for it because everybody wanted their solutions yesterday. But when the change came, it was dramatic, and therefore there was a need to dramatically re-strategize. And people who didn't do it in the time frames, or people who didn't have cash, and I'll keep coming back cash, to be able to make the transition for the next change, had no option but to get bankrupt or close their businesses. So you've got to ask yourself, so when do you really need to change your strategy? Here I'll give you 4 or 5 factors. One is, assess if the past success is going to lead to future success. Is there new competition which can disrupt your own business model? And this is, are you finding that there are things that you're not able to do on your own, where you need maybe some other partner, particularly when you're taking on a larger system? So you look and create an ecosystem of partners who will in turn not only provide you something which helps you to leverage your resources, but also lead you into new directional paths based on their own strengths. And then I say you've got to continuously innovate for differentiators. So you've got to ask yourself, what are the differentiators in my business? And remember that all differentiators have a shelf life. Nothing will last forever. I think you're lucky if a differentiator will have a 2 to 3 year shelf life in context of the speed at which change takes place, speed at which competition will look at you, and so on. And therefore, continuously you've got to keep on creating new differentiators. So I'd say these are, I would just describe as the 4 essential elements of when you need to change strategy and how you go about changing it, by what are the indicators that you have or approaches you have towards changing strategy. And of course, I could have taken any one of these topics and had the whole session on it, so to that extent it is abbreviated. Before I move on to the next part, which is organization building, if somebody would like to ask a question on strategy, I'm quite happy to take a pause right here and take that question. Go ahead.
When you go out, go for an idea, go for something, you need to go research. So research for the idea, whether it's viable or not, whether it's relevant or not.
Sure.
So what are the process of the thought process which one should take care?
Sure.
How to research the market?
Of course, there's the most famous example, which I don't subscribe to, of course, is Steve Jobs saying that he didn't believe in market research. And that's because his point of view, he was so far on the frontier of what technology could do that he could visualize things which the consumer didn't even know they needed, and then say, here's the need, I've helped you to understand that you really, this is what you're hankering after all your life, this is a new way of listening to music, which you didn't know was even feasible. So how could you come and tell me what has to be done in that area? So he really didn't believe in it. But by and large, you do need to do. I'm not sure that market research in a certain sense, I would actually describe it more a function of sizing a market. Is the opportunity large enough? Is the opportunity differentiated enough? In the market, are there segments? So all of you have been through an MBA program. Let me tell you that the basics and fundamentals are all contained there. Where you look at the elements of sizing a market, you look at the demographics of the market, you look at, and in many markets you'd be amazed at how much the change takes place on, in a sense, the edge, areas which are not established economies. Some of the most dramatic innovations in mobile enterprises are actually taking place in Africa. The way they have tapped onto the World Health Organization's mobile programs, they say our role model is the way the work is being done in Africa. So you've got so many things which you need to study in terms of that. Size your market, by all means, you've got to know the size of your opportunity, what is the size of the team. And then that gets linked up with your business plan. I'm not sure that this needs to be done as research in the context of saying, in the traditional sense of research, that you'd go out and call on target consumers and say, do you like this feature, you don't like that feature, should it be shaped like this, should not. If people have understood this pulse, think of yourself as the consumer. You've got a large enough team, you bounce these ideas off VCs. I would not known a startup which started off by saying, I'll do a formal structured market research. I think it's a good idea to get in a marketing consultant who may give you ideas and angles also on that. And it doesn't, it's not difficult validating data on market size and so on, because now there's so much published data. You see the size at which other entities have grown, because it doesn't have to be the first time anybody's done a business anywhere. And there may be some which nobody's done. And in that case, you've got no market data to past data, but you've got an intuition. You've got an intuition of saying, I'm creating an application. And you've got some gut feel and saying that this is the way that application usage has multiplied over the years. And so is there any reason why mine should not? Another thing about all that research, and that's invariably, if you see technology adoption, you see this in something called the Gartner hype curves. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it. But what happens with those Gartner hype curves is they show that the rate of adoption in technology, there are early starters who will adopt to it. And yet, most technologies look like they're never going to fulfill their promise at all. It's when they reach a certain cycle where slowly usage is building into a critical mass, it suddenly takes off. And then afterward there's another trough which comes in later on. The size and width of that curve varies a great deal for different areas, different businesses, different technologies. But almost everything will go through. Something brand new will go through a process of adoption. And which is why it is not necessary to be the first and to enter into a given area, which is why I disagreed with Isner when he says they see something which nobody else has seen. If you look at it today, leave aside Steve Jobs. I mean, he created, he is one man in the entire century. It's not even 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000. But leave that sort of an example aside. When people enter into these sort of businesses, they're not necessarily the first. Google was not the first search engine. Microsoft didn't even have its own operating system. It took a quick and dirty operating system and adapted that because they suddenly got an opportunity with IBM, and they had to get into it in a very quick way. So, and neither is Facebook the first social media entity. You don't necessarily have to be the first. But I think when you get in, you've got to be able to say, how do I do something better and more differently? So I'm not saying don't do any market research, but I have not seen too many startups sitting down and doing structured research in terms of sending out researchers, etc., into the market to do work. It is much more a question of brainstorming, thinking, socializing, dreaming, visualizing it, and of course using market data as a step. Sure, again, whether you need, see, I'll tell you, the moment you begin to use tools, and I'm not sure even if they exist, and maybe a professor knows it better. I certainly didn't see this thing. Any tool was ever taught to us when I did my MBA, but when I did my MBA more years ago than most of you people have been in existence. So I'm sure there's a lot of development, and there could be tools like that. Balanced scorecard and all, I think that they are more a question of making sure that you're doing what you're doing, set out to do. So you've got a balance, you're tracking it and saying, okay, these were our aims, and are we actually fulfilling things in those areas? And the balanced scorecard is not just about strategy, it's about a whole, it's virtually about using it as a methodology for the way you run and structure your company. I've never used it, I must tell you. I looked at it multiple times. I found them very tedious. I found they actually constrain and restrict your thinking. So when it comes to running a company, whereas distinct from a balanced scorecard approach, because I hate things which you then try and reduce to numbers, be it a job sizing or be it a balanced scorecard approach towards the organization. I think people learn to play with those numbers. and you can manipulate them, you can make them look what they are, and you're really spending half your time trying to get down to this. Now, I don't want to, not having tried it, I should not say, hey, I don't think it's a worthwhile tool. If it was more useful, I think many more organizations would have picked it up. Actually, still, you'd be surprised, not even 5-10%. I know within our industry, TCS is one which does use it, but they're the only ones I know who use that approach. So that's more about running a company. In terms of running a company, I believe the best way to do it by a very focused management by objectives approach. So everybody has objectives absolutely down to each and every single person in the company. And you're measuring performance and results against those objectives. And if those objectives tie up on an integrated basis and flow from the company's objectives, so everybody while doing what they're doing is also contributing towards the company's objectives. I'll move on and let me come to organization building. You know, I mentioned that VCs will really fund an idea, but they equally fund the team. And you may think that, funding that I got this most brilliant idea in the world, but in the end they want to know what is the team that is going to be able to deliver, because nobody wants to be able to, put all their bets, firstly in any case, on an individual, and it's the complementarity of the team which is going to be able to deliver. So therefore, the important thing then becomes about how do you select and hire and build up the team that you want. Quite often, and not honestly, what happens in a startup situation is that a group of friends have gotten together, and those friends enjoy working with each other, so and have got this idea and say, hey, we think it will work very well, and they become the founders of the entity and so on. But what they quite often fail to realize is that they don't actually have all the skills which are needed to run a company, and it's surprising, it's from doing a startup and saying, okay, now everybody is focused on product development, for example. Or everybody is focused on saying, okay, now let's build up a team and so on. Everybody wants to get involved in everything. It's important to get into a proper structure for your organization and realize that different people have different roles. And then you may find that there are big gaps. So you've got to actually go out and hire people who are going to hire, to handle maybe jobs which in the hierarchy, if you will, are higher than that of the founders. And the founders have to make space for that, because you don't. Maybe there is nobody within the team who's capable of being, let us say, the chief financial officer, the finance controller, or whatever. When you bring in somebody and give them the space, and also listen to them, and it's not that, in fact, one of the things I like to get out of, for some reason or the other, people who come on the team will always keep on saying they're founders and employees. I try, and once you got the founders in place, of course they were important, but don't get that mindset of saying there's one class of favorite people who are the founders and the other employees. Everybody gets judged on what they do. Now that is an aside. So what are some of the things that I believe that you need to do when you look out for talent and you go about building up your team? The first thing I want you to remember is that you are as weak as your weakest link. So if somebody says, okay, you're so strong, it doesn't matter, you compromise on one job, let me tell you, for a company to succeed, and that is what makes life, and it's not that entrepreneurship is hard, running a company has got to remember all these basics. And you are as weak as your weakest link. And therefore it's important that every function and area should be built into becoming a strong area which is able to deliver on its own steam, on its own objectives, on its own goals, and its contribution to the whole organization. And so therefore what you do, I think you must firstly define the qualities which you think are important to you as an organization. And a sample list of these could include passion, commitment, energy, approach for excellence, being a team worker, and so on. So you look at those, and you look for those apart from any other capability. You look at those capabilities as much as, or these attributes as much as you would the technical skills. I think a successful team leader has got to be a good team member, has got to be a good leader, has a good manager, and a good human being. I think a lot of management books will emphasize that we, and I hate that phrase, says we under-lead and over-manage or stuff like that. To me, they're two sides of a coin. You've got to be a good leader and you've got to be a good manager. And a good leader is about setting a shared vision, about motivating others, thinking of others first before you do of yourself, and so on, setting the right values in the organization. The good manager is doing all the basics of making sure that you're managing by objectives, you're focusing this, your processes in your company are set up right. Everybody is, in a sense, using their time in a way that was, and I think time management becomes a very important thing, and most people don't quite understand how they're spending their time. You don't realize that you need to have mechanisms to improve some of that. So you look for qualities which I think, and I think it's not a bad idea to define the attributes of a good leader, the attributes of, apart from the personal qualities I talked about, attributes of a good manager, and of course, as a human being, those are, I think, really fundamental to what we are, and just says the values of the person. And then test the persons you're looking at against those attributes. And quite often, a lot of people run through these structured interviews, very excessively focusing on just the experience and the expertise they bring in. But I think these qualities, how do you assess those, I think become very important. I think it's important to look for complementarities in skill and diversity. Sometimes it may make it more difficult to manage an entity when you have people who think very dramatically differently in many ways. But I'll tell you that diversity brings different skills, new ways of looking at things, different ideas. And it's important to be able to have that. Quite often as a startup mode and an entrepreneurial mode, we're not going to be able to afford very seasoned, experienced people, because after they cost a ton of money. And I think that's not necessarily bad news. I think I'd much rather go for a bright young person who's going to be able to, you believe, be amongst has the potential to be at least in that functional area amongst the top 10% or top 20% in their sphere, as distinct from somebody who brought in 20 years of experience, but a lot of mediocrity in terms of their achievement. So you can start entities. When we began MindTree, our CFO and head of our people practice were both 27, 28-year-olds. And we didn't have to pay them the bomb. And I think the energy with which they threw themselves in, they were willing to learn at all times. And there's really nothing that I would say that we lost out on functionally by virtue of doing that. When you look at all senior positions in your company, though, you find, and it applies to your own careers, you have to think of yourself, the people you're bringing in who have got to be senior and leading their functional or their business areas or whatever it may be. I think they have got to be strategists, they've got to be great implementers, and they have to have requisite knowledge and expertise. And actually, when you consider that, that is the challenge. The challenge is to be able to get people who are, ideally I'd like to be able to get a person who on expertise, I say, is a great 8 or 9 on 10, a person who on results orientation and implementation is 8 or 9 on 10, somebody on a people orientation is 8 or 9 on 10, and actually that would be the perfect person, but you'll never get there. So then, how do you add value to people in that process wherever the gaps are, but you can't really compromise on the fact that it just doesn't measure up on those scores. And you may think a person who's very, very good in one of the scores but a disaster on the other is actually going to, again, that person's individual weakness will drag them down. And so you've got to be able to assess people on all of those areas. Sometimes on the strategic aspect, if you've got a great operational person, I think you can overcome that by taking somebody who's taking a consultant to supplement the strategic part of it. It doesn't apply to every function. Somebody mentioned about market research, and I think the point I wanted to make there is you can get a marketing consultant who comes and gives you insights quite distinct from the head of marketing in whatever they're doing, because that person has also got a huge implementation role. And it is in ideas like these where strategy, external, I think the external view helps a lot. I mentioned that I had taken a very young CFO. Now the CFO didn't bring all the expertise that I would have wanted, all the perspectives. So that is a sort of area where the external advisor can play a very useful role. But if this guy didn't know how to implement, the external advisor is not going to do that. So you can supplement thought processes by good external people. And the good thing is they're available today. They weren't available 15 years ago. I mean, when I began Happiest Minds, because I built the team later. I just started it standalone. In MindTree days, we had the team in place and literally ready to launch as a team. But here, in putting out the plans, etc., to the VCs, I was standing in, and I knew the people I had to bring on. I needed 4 or 5 months to bring them on, but I wanted to initiate the process of getting the funding also, and that required presenting a marketing plan, required presenting a financial plan. But in both of those areas, we were able to get excellent consultants. So I think it's a good thing to be able to supplement that capability, but that can never make up for, in a sense, basic adequacy of the persons who you are looking for. A few don'ts: don't compromise on quality or values. Assume that past success will be a harbinger of future success. People's motivations change. And somebody who's worked in a big company environment may not succeed in a small company environment because the system delivers so much to them. And I've had innumerable, I can tell you from my Wipro days, I took a person who brought in the largest account, and we took him on as a UK head to manage our UK operations. So we made him country head. He was not the country head there, but he's been the most successful BDM. And he made tons of money on his incentives. It took us 8 months to realize that fellow's whole passion in life had shifted to a stud farm that the fellow had created. We are sitting here, and hardly any work was done in those 8 months. By the time we found out, look at the time and money we'd lost. So past success is not a guarantee. You really have to, and I'd say that's certainly a failing. When you've known people in the past, you sometimes hire them without even a formal interview because you say, okay, fine. But I think you really need to evaluate people as, are they still tuned on in the same way that they used to be in the past. I think particularly in terms of sales positions, and I just mentioned that example to you, I think there more than anywhere else, if you get the wrong choice, I think the choice is an absolute disaster. It's not just the time you lost, it's the opportunity cost of that decision. And it's the area in which I have actually seen the maximum amount of failures also. It may not be that they're any worse than the others, they have really nowhere to hide. The numbers stick out. Sometimes in a larger role, you're able to, and you've built up a team, and the team together is achieving some results, and maybe you don't want to take harsh decisions. But in the case of salespeople, frankly, you cannot afford not to take a decision, and the numbers speak for themselves. Now coming down to attracting and retaining talent, and then I'll take a pause again and say on the organization building, people aspects, etc., etc. If you have questions, the people aspects can cover beyond what I'm talking to you about. In fact, I really like your approach of saying let's take the questions section by section, because then we get focused on what I've just said. Giving people a sense of, so the first thing in attracting and retaining talent, I think the important thing is to give people a sense of purpose which is beyond the role that they're going to fulfill. How do they see themselves as contributing to the larger goals of the company? And I think the best way of doing that is to articulate a good mission statement and a 5-year vision statement, which everybody then internalizes, and we realize that we are all working collectively to achieve that, and it is we together who are making that happen. And when people begin to see their role and they begin to see the larger purpose, in the vision also I think it's important to create certain things which, not just for self-belief, but it creates a sense of pride. And therefore, for example, a vision which includes, even as a startup, that you will give something back to society, social responsibility objective, builds pride in the team in saying, yes, we as a company and as a team are doing that, and we are also doing our bit in terms of contributing towards that. And the vision should, of course, the mission statement should be uplifting. As an example, I think the Happiest Minds mission statement is simple as it could be. It's happiest people, happiest customers. The vision statement has got to go beyond that. It has to have challenging goals. It has to have something is measurable. So we've described it as a 5-year vision, and for us it covers areas including again happiness, because it's so central to the theme of what we are and what we believe, and that's very much a part of our, you might say, our software objective of starting the company. And the next one includes an IPO, then a successful IPO. It's not, this is a measurement criteria defined towards that. The third one talks about governance. Then there's social responsibility, and there's thought leadership. So all of those elements have been brought into our 5-year vision, and in each one of them there's a very defined thing. Now when people live that, internalize that, and believe me, it's not easy to internalize. You need various mechanisms, etc. to do so. The same thing applies equally to values. I think it helps a lot if you have an acronym. In the MindTree days, we developed an acronym called CLASS for the values. Here we have SMILES, which again fits in very well for our happiness theme, and it includes again, there's some commonalities. For example, social responsibility appears here as well as in the vision. But our SMILE stands for sharing, mindful, integrity, learning, excellence, and social responsibility. When we do these, when we internalize them, it's amazing how the values will then influence behavior, and everybody develops a certain mindset of saying, these are the things which are important, these are the things which are important for me to be a good human being. A good leader, a good manager, and a good human being. If you really live by the values of the company, you'll find that you're helping you. So it's a tool for the individual to improve themselves. And once they've internalized it, they begin to see the value. Vision is important because otherwise you don't know. Somebody will ask you, what is your company, what are you setting out to do? And people don't even know. And particularly as you get larger, you'll be amazed at how little people know. Sometimes I interview senior people, and I'm distressed to see how little understanding they have of the big picture of their own organization where they work. Then, so one was giving people the sense of purpose, feeling that they are much more than just the roles that they do contribute towards. I think it's important in terms of attracting and retaining talent is to also focus on building a supply side brand. Are you seen as a great place to work? Are you seen as a place with people-friendly practices? Are you seen as a place where there's a high degree of caring within the organization? Are you seen as a place which is going to help develop career paths for people in a way that is better than others would do? And that's equally important as building your brand, your market brand as you go through. The third, I think, is very important is in terms of your reputation of being a great supply side brand, also the sharing of wealth. In an entrepreneurial mode, if you gentlemen go out and ladies go out to become the entrepreneurs, it's not about the size of the pie, but it's about how you share that also that is important. And it's important then to have a good ESOP scheme. Talking of ESOP schemes, that's another area where I believe we really need a good advisor. There's been so much change in the rule and regulations, and in the end people set up schemes and find that they've subjected people to a very large part of that taken away by tax. But it's still doable in spite of all the tax changes to do it legally and still ensure that people don't end up paying tax on the gains at the end of whatever period that you monetize that. Typically that would be at the time of going public, or if there happens to be an IPO. I'd say you consciously set out to create a great place to work, and all that goes into creating a great place to work. And then you develop an organizational culture which contributes towards that. In terms of attracting talent, I would say the good news is that an increasingly large number of people are really happy to work with startups. And so it's not that I think the safety syndrome has certainly declined enormously in the last decade. There's so many new opportunities come up. So from the angle of saying I'm at a disadvantage with respect to any of the larger players, I'd say absolutely not. So one has, if you do all of the things in the right and basic way, you will be able to attract the talent that you want and need. And then of course to be able to retain that. Now I'll take a pause. I've got 2 or 3 more sections to go. I think we are progressing okay on time. Who's your timekeeper out here? Where we have to end up. Anyway, I think it will take us about, say, another 20 minutes or so all told, between what I have to say and your questions as they come along. So any questions on the organization?
The organization culture different from, say, anybody else in the market?
Sure. Well, that is, of course, that's a good question in itself, in the sense of how do you define a culture? And a culture is very much a part of what you and see around you. That's very important. Now, and also in the process of saying, this is our culture, it's not that you're saying that anybody else's culture is bad or whatever it is. If I look at the 3 companies that I have led, in a sense, Although in Wipro I led the IT business, but a large part of the culture and the basic framework was set up by Mr. Premji. So you could say that, and yet there were distinctions. I would say that the culture you saw with an IT business would have been, although there would have been a common set of values and beliefs out there also, which created the, defined the company culture. But you saw differences in the way it operated from one business unit to the other. But it is important. I mean, I also don't want a business unit culture, but I want a general company culture to pervade through all our business lines as well as our various global practices or industry groups for that matter. So, how is it different? I think to a certain extent, it's what you set out to define as your values. They have the largest impact towards influencing culture, because you've emphasized. And again, I don't want to overstate this in a point. If you see the values as attributes, in a sense, for people, mindful, integrity, learning, excellence, and so on, those are important. But again, I would also tell you that each of those attributes, I'll call them as necessary but not sufficient. So maybe some word which appears in somebody else's values may also be important. But we're saying that these we must see our people trying to live by in every respect. And I think they, more than anything else, can begin to determine the culture of the organization. Second thing is, I think you've got to have mechanisms. You know, there's one basic contradiction. You create fiercely competitive organizations. And yet the most important thing is to see how do you get collaboration between those different aspects of the organization. And that again you create by your reward system, your incentives, the way objectives are set. In our sort of an industry, the collaboration also very often comes through the use of technology like a knowledge management system, where people are pouring in freely into that and sharing from out of that. So you've got to create a system of collaboration, a mindset of, you've got to create perhaps an understanding that there's an, power is not concentrated, power is, and empower people. That itself creates the feeling of saying, I'm in a place where I know I can take certain decisions, and the organization would honor them or have the freedom and the empowerment to take those decisions. There are certain other things in which you have a philosophy and you build those into the thing. Now, for example, we've just stated, and we've just rolled out 2 programs, if you will, which I believe would have an enormous impact on the culture of the company. One is, we said we want to have the best wellness program in the industry. So somebody in the introduction mentioned that I also have his hobbies of yoga and Tai Chi. But we've introduced all of these into the company. And these are only 2 subsets of a wellness program. But we have a Get Active program where of us have sort of got into this and have our pedometers and our thing. So if I'm tracking the fitness, and it becomes something where we're collaborating as a team and saying, hey, who's progressing and who's not. And people get involved in it. The idea here is saying that happiness and fitness are a very important part of your own well-being and your own contribution to success in the company, and the sort of focus we'd like you to do. Now, it will stop people from smoking, I'm afraid. I heard of a horrible word, but it's but we're still working at it. So we get that, and I think so. I mentioned one program. The other program is, for example, we just it's sort of the we'll see its impact this year. Is a performance enhancement process. So we're saying the old appraisals are junked, but we're going to do a holistic performance enhancement, which includes development of people, but the extent to which we're taking 360 degrees feedback in that. So it's not a one top-down appraisal. In the process, you also get a right to comment on both the attributes as well as KRAs of your boss, as indeed your team gets to report on yours, and as well as your peers. It's very comprehensive. It's going to be very difficult to manage in the context of the overheads that we generate because of the data, etc. Fortunately, systems are available whereby I hope we'll be able to make a good job of it. But the goal and aim of that indicates that this is a pure culture which everybody is not just dictating to you from top downwards. Here, this is a holistic development process as distinct from an appraisal process. I think it is things like this which determine the culture and the shades of difference between one organization and the other. Any other questions on organization? good news from the angle of the entrepreneur is that increasingly a large number of people want to work in smaller companies or startup type companies. You said it could have been a company of 100, 150, but for all you know, you might find the right startup. Where you're saying, I'm not seeking to be the entrepreneur, but I do want to be a part of a startup team. What does a company do to be able to help individuals in those areas? I can't say that we've set out to say that because we were a startup, we are doing something different. I think if the basics in terms of how you help people develop their careers are also very fundamental. It doesn't matter whether it's easier in a startup because there are much fewer people to, in that sense, work on. Unless everybody's got so absorbed with their problems that they're really thinking only how we're going to make, bring out a product, bring out a success, etc., rather than helping them. So in course of time, everything that you need to do in terms of people development, including this performance enhancement process I just described, all of those must be made available in an entity. The processes of induction, etc., I think become very basic. They're common here, common elsewhere. Processes of letting everybody build a internalization of the mission, vision, and values. Actually, once you've internalized that, you yourself are in a position to contribute towards the goals of the company. And as you contribute towards the goals, is where you'll be successful. Later on, you come to an area where I would imagine most startups will differ from the larger ones, is there are probably fewer training development programs, because everybody's racing against time to maybe bring out your product, racing against time to get into the market. But in course of time, these have to settle in also. I mean, those have to be there. So they have to be. Now, we didn't have for our first year a leadership and training function because we're just bringing the teams into place. And maybe halfway through the second year, we've introduced it. It's only just about picking up steam. Established organization would have that in place straight away. And they would also obviously have multiple programs which are being rolled out. But on the degree and intensity, having rolled it out now, I'd say we'll offer as many opportunities as, let's say, a more established company would. We may not run through a leadership development program, and probably people like you all need less of it because you've come through a formal MBA, but most people within the organization are not. And those people really do need leadership development skills and so on. So you've got to chart out plans for that. The third is, of course, actually in the end is the environment you've created. How much are you willing to tolerate failure? How much are you willing to tolerate mistakes? So as long as you know that the person has given of their best, you don't want the same mistakes multiple times, but obviously there has got to be a culture which forgives errors, because the person who never makes mistakes is the person who's doing nothing to start with. So I can think of multiple ones which have cost collectively upwards of millions of dollars, and that will happen as long as you balance out the pluses. Firstly, you create your own pool, and you know how many shares you're going to have. So if you started with 100,000 shares, and which is not very much, so you probably have much more because those shares in the beginning are valued at 2 rupees or something like that. Investors would have obviously come in at a much larger price, so you value those shares at say 2 rupees or 5 cents overseas and so on. And then that pool, so let's assume most startups, I'd say if I look at Silicon Valley companies, would take 20% of the pool for options. So if you had started with 100,000 or started with 1 million, let's say, so you created 20% of that, so you've got a pretty large pool of stocks to be able to give out. But you know that that stock has got to last you through, let's say, at least 4 or 5 years of building the company. At that stage, if you have a huge new capital investment, you can create more of a pool for the next round of people. But you're really talking how do we get this pool in place. Now you've got in view the organization you're setting out to create, so you know all the positions up front. And if you happen to know all those positions and you choose a grid, if you will, we call it like a grid, and you bring people on with X number of shares based on that grid, and you've got a mathematics worked out, say it'll last me through my 4 or 5 years. So I know I've got 1 million shares, but I've kept 20% out of that. So I've got 200,000 shares to be able to distribute. It's not 20% out of that, you actually generate new shares. So the 20 becomes 16.6 because it then becomes 20 upon 120. And that pool, again another approach, I think most people probably take that. We certainly did ourselves, is that grid doesn't remain constant. You've got to realize that there is more of a risk taken by the person who comes and joins you in the very first few months of the company, then somebody who comes in a year later or 2 years later. So what we've done is, for the same level of position, we've reduced the grid shares in year 1 and year 2. Important thing is that can you sustain the share price at the same level also at which it is issued, or keep it as low as you can, because that's where the wealth thing comes in. I will give you a number for ourselves. I mean, we've got shares were issued at 2 rupees on the ESOP scheme. Now, investors came in at 30. So there's already a built-in appreciation of 1,500%. Assuming we go ahead and that has got to be increased as we go along. Now, 2.5 years down the stream, I am just increasing that issue price to 5 rupees. So it's not gone up enormously from 2 to 3 and now 5. But there's a cost towards doing that. In the sense you have to account for the loss in terms of the value is higher, but you're doing it. But anyway, it's a book loss. One way or the other you're giving. If you issued it at 20, of course, you'll also get in more money. We as a company probably create that I know in the space. And I think we created a pool of 25%. So 25 upon 100 comes down to 20% net, as it is still 16.6. But 16.6 is a big number. It still gives you a lot for people to share.
What are the key factors that you keep in mind when approaching for a services desk?
Years ago when we began MindTree, the only game in town was services. And so you have Web 2.0 companies though, so they make my trips and so on and so forth, which will attract funds very easily. Now, when you have services in place, that is that the distinction between product and services is blurring. And therefore, if you position your company as a software, as a services company, that's where all the money is going at the moment. So, and I'm talking of the IT space. It could even be a healthcare delivered as a service, and so on, remote diagnostics. So anything which could seem to be generating streams of revenues because the service is being delivered through a platform, through the cloud or whatever, is a very, very attractive area for VCs. And having said that, you've got to remember that we're a service-based economy, so the bulk of the opportunities are going to exist in the services area. And it's not that they would, with the right differentiators, they would focus on those. Now take us, for example. I think they would not have funded a vanilla IT services company, but because we said that we're focusing on cloud, we're focusing on security, we're focusing on mobility, those are the areas which they're seeking to fund. I mean, they may be funding a product startup in security, but they also realize that because there's so many of these, that there's so much opportunity in these areas. So you have to choose, in a sense, the markets which are hot. Okay, I think I should move on in the interest of time, because so I'll now move on to a few do's and don'ts and things to avoid. The first thing is that business is about taking and joining any company, and I have addressed this largely to potential entrepreneurs. I said a lot of it is basics. You may become a CEO of a company at some stage. What are the important things for you to see? And I say that while you're taking your risks, don't ever bet the company in the price. You have to have risks which you can chew and manage in a way that they don't completely destroy the entity. And you have to realize that everything will not succeed. It's very, very unlikely as you go through that each and every initiative will succeed. A very fundamental basic point in terms of values and governance, I'd say that please don't ever look for shortcuts. Don't do things which are inappropriate. The moment you compromise on them, is not even worth saying that you've been successful, because that success has been achieved at a price which you think will come back and bite at no time. And it would apply even into a managerial setup, but more so in an entrepreneurial setup. I say avoid getting carried away with early successes or getting overly despondent with early failures. You've got to be able to live with the high highs, as I mentioned, as well as the low lows. They will be there. And it will happen in life also. Perhaps there will be things which seem to bring an enormous amount of euphoria almost and saying, hey, look how wonderful we are. And then you can get complacent. And on the other hand, there's no reason to get overly despondent when things go wrong. And remember, there will be failures. You know, there's another important thing which I see very differently. People say, how do you learn from your failures? You should, but I think you learn much more from your successes also. So learn from what you do, you believe best, and what you think has worked well for you, rather than all the time moping on the failures and what went wrong. Of course you learn from them. You hopefully don't make the same mistakes. But there are a couple of very interesting experiments which show that when two teams were given a task and a project to do, then one team was given feedback on all that they did well. The other team was given a feedback on all that they did badly. And then when they were asked to come back and repeat the exercise, the team which focused and was told all they did well improved its scores. The scores to start with might have been more or less the same, but one was told this you did well, this you did badly. The team which focused on what they did well improved its scores dramatically over the teams which told what they did badly. So it's just the mindset it develops, the energy it develops within the organization or the team or group. Keep celebrating your successes in that sense, but also learning from them. Now, with this, I've got only one more section. I may as well take it up and then take a final round of questions. And that is handling adversity and building for the future. So I mentioned to you about not being carried away by success or being overcome by things which didn't work out well or the failures. And here I must tell you, it's very important for you to remember that good times and bad times don't last forever. There will be a change. There are cycles in businesses. You should be using the good times to prepare yourself for the bad, and the bad times to be ready to take advantage of the new opportunities which will appear when the good times come around. I think that is the one difference that we did when MindTree managed to survive and go on to do a very successful IPO as compared to the other entities which dropped forward. Because we said, okay, now where is the market shifting to, and if our market has collapsed, where is it going to be? And we were ready for it when the collapse came at that stage. I've said about learning from your failures, but focus more on your success. So it's focusing on the success. I think there's another very important one, and that is converting every problem into an opportunity. Let me tell you, in every problem, be it a personal setback, in a business setback, you sit back on it and examine it, and let's say, well, now how do I convert this problem into an opportunity? It's a mindset. It's a question of saying, I'll take on a challenge because of something that has happened, as distinct from saying, this is something that is going to come and crush me. And I think it's very important to look for those problems. And if you look deep enough, you'll find there's an opportunity within a problem. Last thing, and this is perhaps it's a basic managerial thing, much more important to in an entrepreneurial world, and that is conserving your cash. If you don't have the money to survive, then of course you're going to be out. So that's where you have people, and it can happen to a very large entity. I mean, look at what's happened to Kingfisher. So the important thing at all times is to see that you have enough cash within to help you to be able to achieve goals, to be able to meet the sudden downturn, to assume that your business plan will probably end up being 30% behind on revenue and maybe 20% higher on costs. There's a huge swing between the two of them, and yet you've got to have the cash to be able to last through that thing. So that is the important thing to do. In fact, I have another phrase which I want to sort of, when it comes to raising money, and we talked about VCs, basically you take your decision making based on cash to such an extent that you look at the decision from the angle of what I'll call as your cash time frame to the next round. Supposing if you had to take a very simple decision of, say, owning your own building like most IT companies do, and renting a premises. Now, if you own your building, you used a very large amount of your own cash. Of course, you reduce your profitability because you are no longer paying somebody a very fancy rent. But at the same time, by spending that money on the building, you probably need to go to the, let's say, VCs for a second round in maybe 2 years' time. But if you are able to defer that decision by another 3 years, say, by only renting premises, next time you go to the market, instead of a valuation of, let us say, $10 million, you may have a valuation of $50 million. Now you dilute your company and your ownership much less by having based your decisions not on the profitability, but on the cash and the conservation of cash. And the second aspect about conservation of cash is simply, as we said, why did MindTree survive when the other dot-coms failed? We had the cash to see us through the times. If we had not had that, if you had to raise cash, I would say you must initiate that at least 8 months before you actually require. That's a very basic thing. And finally, another entrepreneurial mindset linked with cash. Do much more with less. What are you leveraging your thing? So with this, I'm really done. The questions have been good so far. Maybe we have time to take 1 or 2 more. Money does help you to scale and grow. Obviously, you can afford a larger organization, you have the right people in place and so on, and pay them also the ability to attract. So the disadvantage that I see of bootstrapping is this, that yes, you will hopefully get it, and actually you might say there's a contradiction a little bit in what I just said to you. But I said, if you defer your cash requirement even for a decision, you go out into the market with a slightly higher value. Whereas on the other hand, if you took money up front, you have to part with a certain X%. So how do you go about some of that? See, the first thing is that if your idea and your team excite a VC, you also got to realize that the VC is now competing for your business. It's not a question of going with a begging bowl. You look at people and say, hey, I've actually got something which is going to give you an opportunity to make a lot of money. I can tell you my VCs are grateful to me for the fact they made fortunes out of the investments. But in the process, when you're doing it and which is where I say the advantage of a late stage entrepreneur, you're able to convince them that, look, you don't value the company on the fact that this is the size of the team, this is the idea, etc. You truly value it on the basis of the business plan. And the business plan shows you revenues and profitability at a certain stage. And at that stage, you factor that valuation in from the word go. So to start with, I mean, in both cases, we took a lot of money at MindTree and Happiest Minds. But we were able to get good valuations when we started. So we didn't have to wait for the 2 years to say, maybe 2 years downstream, the guy would have pointed out all the negatives, actually, because nothing goes as per plan. In fact, I saw how valuation changed even as markets changed when I began discussing with my VCs this time around. I was with him. Didn't change the value, but he changed some conditions and ifs and buts if we didn't meet our goals. And suddenly one day, the stock market dropped 450 points. Europe collapse had begun, and we dropped 450 points. And straight away he said, look, I think this is going to be a very difficult environment for you to start. And at that point of time, I was able to say, okay, don't change the value because we've agreed upon it, but if you think we won't achieve what we want, then you put in some conditions whereby you won't put in the next tranche if we have not fulfilled those conditions. And that seemed to them an acceptable approach, because we said we still have the confidence this is not going to make a difference to us. Of course, it didn't mean that you had to achieve 100%. We negotiated an X%, and I said, if you achieve at least that X%, surely you're committed to help funding the company for its future. So you got, I'll tell you one other angle though, in talking with VCs. I began, for those of you who may not know, I spent 20 years of my life in engineering, and I dealt with hardcore CPM trade union leaders. There's one commonality in dealing with those union leaders and dealing with VCs, and that's got nothing to do with their mindsets, is that they have experience that you don't have. When I dealt with the trade union guys, he's dealt with 100 managers like myself, and he knows how to turn you around with this thing in a way that you could never imagine, because look at the season and experience that they have. So the VCs have dealt with hundreds of entrepreneurs. This is the first time that you're doing it, or the second time maybe you do it. I think you really need expert advice with you and a financial advisor, which we did do. We did it in Happiest Minds. I did not do it, by the way, in MindTree. Then we had an excellent result, but the difference there is that I had VCs who were pursuing me and saying, when are you going to start on your own? The dot-com boom was on. So everybody was euphoric. And therefore, we were able to get a very good valuation. I didn't need that advice. And but this time around, I certainly needed someone to help me structure a deal in such a way that I was not giving away more than I needed to do. Okay. But I'd still be in favor of saying if you can get yourself a good valuation, the idea is getting your valuation of a percentage you give away. You get your story strongly enough, you can get the money in. I suppose in a certain sense, somebody who's looking to cash out will know that it's a good time to cash out because you'll get interest coming in from multiple places. And you could also be right. I mean, my own mindset obviously is saying I'm not looking for that. I want to build a company. Because ultimately, when you take a company public also, that value becomes a liquid value for the entity. So you don't necessarily need to sell out what might have been your dream, etc. And yet at the same time, perhaps there's no harm in doing it because some entities, like the current things that you've seen, could never in their own steam have generated that sort of value. It's only when a larger player came out and said, I'd like to make you a part of, so Snapdeal today or WhatsApp yesterday, the valuations that they would have got by somebody willing to acquire them are out of the world. And for them to have created entities which they could have taken public on their own at those values, I think would have been exceedingly difficult. It's only when a larger player says that in my umbrella, I can make this opportunity to go much further than this team will be able to do. So that's one criteria. Is there something which you believe that you will not be able to scale adequately yourself, but under a larger umbrella where people bring in synergy with their other businesses, that new buyer finds it very useful to their portfolio, and in turn, you find is able to scale much more than you would have been able to scale it yourself. I think at that time it becomes a complete win-win because that person is paying for something which they know they can create value out of beyond the value that you would be able to create out of. So I think that could be one way of looking at it. And then the market will give you the answer if that's what you're seeking. Because people see what's there. I mean, I don't suppose the WhatsApp guy knew the guys at Facebook or wherever they got acquired from. But they see what's happening in the market. And then remember one thing, that there's a band of merchant bankers. You could also keep in touch with them. In fact, they would give you advice. There's a whole bunch of merchant bankers, and they're not all necessarily working on the largest deals. So you have companies like Avendus, etc., working on small deals. They will find the right fit for you because they sense the synergies. Okay? Okay, we've got two more hands. I'll take both of those and then we'll wrap up. It's already 12:50, so. Yeah.
Issues you face and how you sort of deal with them.
So if it is a divide of that sort, then obviously the path is clear. In a sense, you've got to be ready with your product and your offering, and then you begin to put in all the investments. Or even if it's a service company, you need to have all your base offerings. There's a certain number of offerings in place. There's a team which is going to come and refine and improve them before you spend a lot of money in building a huge organization which doesn't have the value. And when and where do you scale up also? For example, when do you enlarge your field force? If you don't have enough to give your field force in terms of offering, then you're really wasting a lot of money. How much time do you spend on marketing campaigns? When there's nobody to get the benefit, there's not even a field force to take the benefit of that campaign adequately. So scaling up is, to my mind, much more a function of the timing of different types of decisions. At what time do you put money into a given area, which is then going to be able to take the benefit of the money that you've put in to give you an end result. It's also a function at times of mindset of the people. Everybody is not well equipped to do it. You know, in Silicon Valley, they have a very different type of an approach, and the VCs there play a much more activist part. They have they've got their own pool of what they call as startup VCs, who they know will be able to tell the founders, you bring this guy on as a VC, he'll help you get started. Because he's been there, done that, knows the ropes about it. At a certain stage, for scalability, they think of another VC. Now, I'm not saying I subscribe to that as idea. It's very common there. It's beginning to happen here also. Though, if you will look at it, the most successful founder-run entities which went on to become very successful, very large companies, the founders stayed on from the very beginning, be it Infi or whatever, and they're the ones who scaled the company. So if you feel you have the mindset and the capability to do it, there's no need to say, I need to bring in a professional CEO. Now take, on the other hand, Google. For all the brilliance of those two guys, they chose to bring in an Eric Schmidt to provide them the ability to scale and create a business per se, while they were saying, fine, we've got this wonderful, great idea which we've begun to implement. And it's after many, many years only that Larry Page has said, I'll take over. And Eric Schmidt has obviously stepped aside. So it is a people issue, it's a timing issue.
Firms which are offering the same. You're providing something which is very focused, one set. So how do you price your service? Clutter market. How do you price it?
One axiom I must tell you is that one, never create a business which is just based on price competitiveness, of saying I can be cheaper than the next, because that's a disaster. Also, your costs are not going to be nice. And I have very frustrating customers I sometimes go to, and so we classified companies as tier 1, tier 2, and you're a startup, so you're not even tier 2, so you're tier 3. And therefore, the price we will give you is going to be less than what we'll give the tier 1 guy. I said, look here, are you expecting less value from me? Do you think the skills of my people are going to accept poor quality out of those people? Then why should you give me less? I'm going to deliver to you the same quality or better. Maybe a more focused team, maybe more experienced people. But we're a tier 3 company, so why should I price being less than that? And that's a customer who's only looking at you as a pricing thing, is trying to stay away from them. Now, therefore, the thing is that you price on the basis of the value that you're delivering. So look at the value you're delivering and focus on that, rather than saying that this is the cost of what I deliver. And if you can convert it into, let's say, something which is non-linear in itself in terms of pricing, that's wonderful, because then it's not based on, say, in our type of business, on a man-month, etc. Increasingly, where software as a service comes in. So pricing is also a function of the model through which you do your business. Can you change the rules of the game in such a way that somebody is no longer focused on just the price? If you're in a project type of a business, then you focus on saying, okay, I'll deliver the following output to you, but the last thing is to get into that this is so many people working for so many months and years. This is the project, this is sort of value is going to add in, this is the expertise we are bringing in. And we believe that this is really going to deliver you so much value that the cost that we are charging is really nothing compared to the value we'll deliver. Once you've convinced and built that trust in a customer, then I think pricing is the last thing that they'll discuss. In fact, I think the best thing is that pricing should not come up as a discussion until the customer is absolutely clear that this is the company I want to work with. Once he's clear on that, he's not going to bang it on a price. But if in the very first meeting he comes and starts talking price with you, then odds are he's going to hammer you on price. So you have to change the thing to first get your story across.
You're saying the value which the customers will know.
What you're delivering as a value, that determines the value of your service or your offering. Okay, good. Thank you very much. Enjoyed speaking to you all. And it was because you are an experienced team in yourselves, so your questions are related to the real world. And I hope you'll all have healthy, successful careers in whatever you set out to do.
The opening ceremonies and the closing ceremonies with a lot of fascination. And the opening ceremonies always starts off with a lot of fanfare and expectancy. And the closing ceremony is more or less like an anticlimax, that everything is done. In a lot of ways, this talk from you is like a closing ceremony for our batch, the seminar series and everything. But I'd like to think of it as the opening ceremony for the rest of our days outside of IIM Bangalore. The journey outside of this, especially for the people who are looking at entrepreneurship, is going to really benefit from the talk that you had today. Thank you so much for making your time to be speaking with us today. We really are very privileged to have you here. Thanks so much. As a token of gratitude. Thank you.